Special Operations, Covert Ops, Espionage, The Team House, with your hosts, Jack Murphy and David Park.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 172 of The Team House. I'm Jack Murphy here with Dave Park, and our guest today on this Wednesday episode is Holden Triplett. Holden is a former FBI counterintelligence agent. He served here in New York. He served in Moscow, Beijing, Washington, D.C., did a year up at the White House with the National Security Council. Real depth of experience, and also working eyeball to eyeball with the Russian FSB and the Chinese state public security section?
Yeah, the MPS, Minister of Public Security.
Yeah, Holden, I mean, I really appreciate you coming into the studio and doing this interview with
My
us.
pleasure.
And I think, I was telling you before the show, we've interviewed a number of counterintelligence people who come from various perspectives, but I think yours is very unique and contemporary. So I'm very interested to hear from someone like you who's an insider, especially about like the culture of these institutions, these foreign intelligence institutions that we have various types of interactions with, not all of them so pleasant, as opposed to, what I can do is speculate, and I can tell people what I read in the newspaper, but you actually lived it, so I'm excited to hear about it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. It was really fortunate to have that experience, and so I was happy to share it.
So most of our shows, we start off asking our guests sort of about, your upbringing and, what your path was into federal service in your case. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that journey was like on your end.
Sure. Funny enough, I mean, my dad was actually in the FBI for 30 years, although I never considered going into federal service. It was kind of his thing. He did it, so I was going to go in a totally different direction. Although I will say we grew up with, he came in like 68 until 99, so it was during the Hoover era, and we had a lot of Hoover pictures all over our house, J. Edgar Hoover pictures. And I actually thought the guy was my grandfather, because my grandfather had passed away before I was born. So for the first couple of years, I always thought they were it was my grandfather. And so I'm sure I'll have a psychiatrist unpack that at some point and that'll help me through some things. But anyway, so maybe it was foreordained where I was going to end up at the end of the day. But I was actually in law school at Berkeley during 9/11, and as a lot of people felt that was sort of the calling of my generation. Like I had to participate, I needed to be a part of it, and there were so many things to protect our country. So I mean, the joke I make is I traded in my Birkenstocks for a Glock and went on my way.
I was going to say, not too many FBI agents come out of Berkeley, do they?
So I for a while I was the only one, and the way I know this is the head of alumni and recruiting at Berkeley Law School. He would always hit me up with people who are interested in the FBI. And he's like, "Hey, I'm sorry, Holden, I keep calling you." He's like, "But you're the only one." He's like, "There's no one else who went to Berkeley who's now in the FBI." I think there are a couple now, but anyway, back in those days, there weren't that many. So it's not a typical trajectory,
right.
And so, but I will say, a number of my friends went into federal service on the kind of prosecutor side from Berkeley, so it just tends to be a different pathway.
Did he give you statistics of how many go into the MSP?
Yeah, exactly right. A lot of going into going overseas in China, and I will say there is a fairly leftist contingent at Berkeley. It fits the stereotype in some ways, but there's also there was some fairly middle of the road, and even some people who were kind of on the right side of things there too. So, but anyway, it was an exciting time. But anyway, so soon after I graduated, I was at a firm and applied for a number of different agencies. The Bureau actually moved faster than others, and this is right around the time the 9/11 report came out, which kind of designated the Bureau to be sort of the main counterterrorism arm, and that's what I wanted to do. And so I applied and then entered right at the beginning of 2006, went to Quantico.
And you had some interesting experiences growing up, international experiences, living in Russia, Japan during college. Was this already sort of in your mind that this was going to sort of lead you into a national security pathway?
Maybe. I mean, I didn't plan it that well. It just sort of, I took a gap year after high school and maybe it was sort of always in the blood, and went to Russia back in 1993, and when it was a total mess. But it was really a great experience. Only to I learned about 10 years later, my dad told me he was still in the bureau at the time, and he was sort of freaked out while I was there. But he was working counterintelligence Russia while I was in Russia.
Yeah.
But it was a very different time. Everything's kind of started to fall apart, so it wasn't the same sort of threat level that they've been dealing with, during the Cold War. But no, I would always been
You're
super.
a second-generation FBI counterintelligence agent.
Yeah,
There
I
should
am.
be a series of novels written about your family.
That's right. There's a lot of pressure on my kids, right? They got to
Right,
come
right.
into this in some
You
way.
can't hide nothing.
Right.
That's right.
Start that paranoia early, right?
I tried to. I mean, I may have a few cameras at home, just maybe all over their phones. But no, I'm sort of always interested in the international aspect of it, and I learned Russian, and then I'd spent some time in Japan, and I'd spent some time in China actually after law school, and so I always liked going overseas, and so that kind of drew me in to do something. The bureau isn't typically, the bureau is mainly domestic, but does have some overseas offices, which I was fortunate enough to get to. But what's really changed is what used to be a really domestic mission. I mean, as you all know, I mean, the line between what's domestic and foreign now is pretty much been obliterated, right? So, I mean, just take the cyber world. Like, you have an individual in whatever country in the world basically doing almost, what they could do in person, via a computer to someone in the United States. And so, is that an FBI role? Is that another agency's role? It's hard to say what's domestic and foreign now. So that mission's really kind of expanded.
Now, while you were in law school and 9/11 went down, you were actually thinking about going a different way, right? You started thinking about going in the military.
I did. I thought about going to the military. I mean, that's what everyone, it looked like we were all going to go to war, and then, soon after, to go to Afghanistan, and obviously, very soon after that, we went into Iraq when I was still in law school. And so, yeah, I was very close to doing that. And then, just sort of talking with people, I thought that my skill set would be better used in the bureau. Nothing against the military by any means, but it's just some of the things that with the law background, my dad had done, and wanted to do the investigations and the interviews and some of that's where I kind of got drawn to, more or less.
Yeah, that's great.
And so you go through Quantico, and I think we talked about Quantico just on the last episode with Greg Schaefer.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah.
Before you hit the ground in New York City, before we get to that, I mean, any fun stories, Quantico stories that you want to toss out there?
So I have kind of long hair, and this is about the length I had when I went to Quantico, which is not Quantico length, apparently.
Not on J. Edgar Hoover's time.
I guess not.
No, sir.
So I mean, I was at a law firm, and I kept it professional, I thought, but yeah, I mean, there was still a sort of the idea that you should have sort of a high and tight while you're there, or at least sort of a little bit more kept than I kept it. So when I did my PT test, push-ups is a big part of it, and so I'm doing this, and the guy's sitting there watching me, and I'm 1, 1, 1, and I look up, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, I'm going as low as I'm touching the ground with my chest, and he's like, I'm sorry, your hair's in the way, so I can't really see if you're touching the ground at all. So anyway, that kind of fun hazing that went on there. So I ended up buzzing it while I was there, just to more tongue in cheek, but I got a lot of, hey, great haircut, man. Like, it isn't a haircut, it's just buzzed. Like, there's nothing to it. So no, but it was a good time. It's interesting going through there. My class average age was about 30 or 31. I was 30 at the time, so a lot of second career people who'd kind of gotten drawn in after 9/11. Yeah,
It's not like the military, a bunch of 18-year-olds.
No, and it's a different mentality. So there's not it's a little bit different. Although the parts of that are the kind of the physical activity and kind of getting you into shape. That I think there's probably some similarities there in terms of some hazing, some aggression of trying to get it, but at 30, you're kind of like, dude, why is this guy yelling at me?
Right,
Or at 18, I'm sure, it's a little bit different of an impact
I gotta
on
do
you.
better, run faster.
Exactly. I'm like, well, I'll just go back to my law job. Like, it's not going to work out.
Right.
But no, it was a great experience. And I actually thought I was going to go back to San Francisco, where I'd processed out of. But typical bureaucracy. The bureau was at capacity in San Francisco for like the first time in 40 years. 'Cause these high cost of living offices are hard to fill, and so if you want to go to LA or San Francisco or New York, you can usually get there. And so my wife and I wanted to go back to San Francisco. She was from California, and anyway, but it was a 2-week period where the bureau was at capacity. So it's just the most bureaucratic process. Talking to them, say, well, right, but in 2 weeks you'll be under FSL, as they call it, they'll be under the needs of the office. She's like, well, right, but that's not when you're processing. So, of course, no one in my class goes to San Francisco, and I ended up going to New York, which was great. But then the next class, like 5 people ended up going to San Francisco, none of whom wanted to go. So very, typical. You go to the needs of the bureau where they're going to send you that kind of thing and stuff. But anyway, it was a great experience. And if you're going to do counterterrorism in the FBI, New York is really the place to do it. So,
why is that?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is, I think just being an incredibly diverse place, but being a symbol of the United States in many ways. I mean, people think about New York, and obviously Twin Towers, and just the entire skyline of New York, the economic power that's here, and that's what a lot of people, I think, feel around the world, for better or for worse, can feel the economic power of the United States. And so I think that continues to be sort of a focal point for outside people when they think about what's a symbol of the United States, right? And so Al-Qaeda's philosophy, right? They want to hit political, they wanted to hit military, and they want to hit economic, right? And so that's why they were trying to hit, they hit the Pentagon and they hit the Twin Towers, and obviously still unclear if they're going to hit the White House or the Capitol exactly, but somewhere in the political sphere.
And so when you hit the ground working in the counterterrorism office here in New York City, okay, 9/11 is in the past. What's going on in the time frame when you get here?
Yeah, so it's about 5 years later, not quite, and so still big hole in the ground. Mm-hmm. No, nothing had been built yet. City was fighting with itself about things, and everyone was still just on edge, kind of constantly. There were just a number of cases. Basically, every couple of weeks, we had a new sort of individual kind of trying to come through and cause mayhem, death in some unique way. And so we were busy. Lots of command posts running around, kind of trying to get a handle on things. Really great experience working with like a huge number of different agencies in the U.S. government, overseas partners. So it was, and really a lot of this had been built very quickly after 9/11, but it was still kind of coming together and coalescing. And so it was fun to be a part of that. I mean, I played a very small part kind of as a new agent, but trying to make those connections with people and to build that larger network to prepare to basically protect the United States and protect those countries. And it may seem obvious, you see in the movies that that we can share intel with the UK or with the Dutch or whatever, but like there's a whole process, and it used to be extremely difficult. And 9/11 really kind of broke down a lot of those barriers and needs for it. And thankfully, we're kind of reaping the what we sowed during that time in a good way. That we've set up those connections for the fight that we have right now. So.
What was it like being a rookie FBI agent, coming to really the epicenter of counterterrorism in the United States?
I mean, overwhelming in some ways, because it was just, New York is just a huge city, and so to get your head around all that could be going on within the city itself was hard. And then on top of the fact that you have just so many federal agencies here, and then the NYPD. And the NYPD itself is bigger than the entire FBI. So they could just really, they had just an enormous amount of power to kind of throw around. And so realizing that you were, to do any, versus like if you're an FBI agent, say in like Oklahoma City or Kansas City, where I'm from, like then you have a lot more power in that sense, because there's just not as many agencies running around. Here you're one of many, and so you've got to learn how to cooperate, how to talk to people. You've got to figure out, what is the NYPD? What are they worried about? What are their sort of equities in these types of things? And so that's hard, and that's a part I didn't really think was going to be a big piece of this, right? The sort of like bureaucracy almost, and navigating that. But that's as important of a part of it, not as sexy by any means as the other pieces, but as important a part of it as anything else.
I'm wondering, like, how heavily are we being targeted in this city? Were there any like near misses where you were just like really like that one got you sweating?
No, not at all. No, I mean there were a number of things that like happened that I'm very happy that we had extremely capable and good overseas partners that helped give us information, as well as other parts of the U.S. government and the intelligence community, because there were a lot of things that came in. They got things last minute, and doing their best, and no, not disparaging anyone at all, but and then we had to act very fast in order to kind of sort of play catch up. Because the difference really, as the bureau, which is operates sort of a law enforcement and an intelligence agency, but with regards to people in the United States, it's really much more so on almost the law enforcement side of things, because that everyone, whether a U.S. citizen or not, you get more or less the same rights. Certainly with regards to the Fourth Amendment, any person here in the United States gets that protection. But so what that means is that there's just a whole number of barriers to get through to meet needs of field. If you want to go up on a wire, if you want to be able to do other types of techniques in order to figure out what are these people doing. And so we might get one single piece of information about, hey, this individual is interested in joining a group and committing jihad, and that would be the extent of it. And you're like, all right, now what do we do with that, right?
Right.
Because that's not enough in of itself to listen to their phones or to look at their email, but it's enough to do other things. You have to start building. And if they're and they want to do this in 2 weeks, you're like, okay, we've got a really short time frame in order to do that. So so it was fast paced for a lot of that, which was, again, great as a new agent. That's what you want to get really, they talk about New York as like dog years, right? Like 1 year, it's equivalent to 7 years in one of the other offices. And I don't, again, I don't bad about my brethren in other places, but I mean, I really felt like you get a lot in a really short time. So, I went overseas pretty quickly on various operations, and then was in Saudi Arabia and in various other places in the Middle East for a few months, kind of doing some joint work with their services, and did that pretty early on. The opportunities that wouldn't have been possible in any other office, but because of the work you do here, they want that experience, and they're going to push it out overseas.
On previous shows, when we've talked about the different authorities that like the CIA and the FBI have, and why it's good for them to work together overseas and also in the United States sometimes, are there different authorities that the FBI has that the NYPD doesn't, or the NYPD does?
That's a really good conversation piece, because people are under a lot of misconceptions about what the CIA does versus the FBI, especially domestically in the United States.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing just to be really clear is the CIA has to follow U.S. law. You should be very clear about that. If they don't, they get in trouble. I'm not going to say that people have made mistakes in the past, but what that means is that the same protections that U.S. citizens have against the FBI or the police, like the Fourth Amendment or other things, that applies to the CIA too, applies to them. They do not have investigative authority to go and look at U.S. citizens. They have certain intelligence powers where they can essentially develop intelligence. Some of that can happen in the United States, but the vast majority of their resources are overseas in order to do that. But the difference between the Bureau and the NYPD, so there's a lot of similarity. I mean, one is just sort of federal versus kind of state and local, right? I mean, they have wiretaps at the local level as we do, and there's a lot of parallels where it really takes a very diverges a lot is with regards to national security investigations and the ability to use FISA, right? So this is something that I think in the last few years we've had some crazy investigations at the top level and all these different things, right. And there's been a bit of a misconception about. So as I mentioned, generally the Bureau looks at it's kind of using their law enforcement powers when they're dealing with people in the United States. The exception to that is if someone is a member of or is associated with a foreign power, and then they can be treated sort of under national security laws, which includes FISA, right? So meaning that if someone
joins Al Qaeda,
exactly, and I don't need to show that they've committed a crime in order to potentially get a FISA to listen to their phones or to read their emails. I can show that they've joined a foreign power that's hostile to the United States, and that's enough. Where versus, if I went out and they heard some information that I was trying to commit some sort of string of robberies or something like that,
right.
They would have to get up to a certain level of evidence, right, to prove in court in order to get what's called the Title III. Right, so it's very different. They'd have to basically show a crime was being commissioned, or there's information that's in the process of it, or planning, etc., versus someone who is part of a foreign power just by the fact they're part of Al Qaeda, or they're part of the Russian embassy or the Chinese embassy. That is enough in order to, under FISA, for an investigation to be opened up. They don't have to be a criminal.
And FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Yes, thank you.
Which has we've had it for 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50.
We've had
1980, right? 78?
We've had it for, I'm blanking right now on when it first came into being, but I can tell you an interesting story because my dad didn't have it. So there was no FISA back then. And there's a number of cases about this, and it's really interesting. So let's think about this. If you are an FBI agent in San Francisco, as my dad was in the early 1970s, and the Soviets are building a new embassy, what is your ability to go and make sure that the Soviets aren't doing all the horrible things that they were doing
right.
during that time? if you go and try to do something criminally, it's in an open court. It's in a record. And if the Soviets are worth a damn, they're going to go out and going to make sure they're going to read these things. And they're going to, oh, the bureau's up on my phone. Well, I'll switch and get a new phone number or whatever. I won't use the phone. So there was really no ability within the system in order to handle national security threats. Hoover, in his eminent wisdom at the time, said, well, those laws don't apply to the FBI in this circumstance because this is national security, and so we're going to do what we need to do. And there's all sorts of court cases about some of the things that they did do.
Right.
But there was no FISA. All sorts of things happened. A number of cases, COINTELPRO being one of them. The Bureau had a number of really horrible missteps. I mean, this is circumstances where really good people can do horrible things without the right type of oversight and controls. It happens all the time in the government, unfortunately. Not all the time. It happens with not a huge amount of infrequency, rather. And FISA came out of that, which is like, look, we need something outside of a normal criminal process that allows the FBI and potentially others to be able to use these tools when you have a foreign power. And that's what FISA. And so it came out of really in a sense of a way to protect Americans because it has a very specialized sort of system for it. Obviously, a lot of controversy around it, but the impetus for it was
right. Essentially, that foreign governments do not enjoy American rights afforded by the Constitution, and if you're working for a foreign government, you also shouldn't enjoy those rights.
So, yes, I mean there's some nuance there, but they don't get the exact same level, right?
Okay.
And so there still is court process, right? But in terms of what types of protections they get in certain, it's different. But partly what you have to do in a FISA application, in many ways, is show that foreign power is trying to do, harm the United States.
Right.
And so there's a bit of nuance within it, but the idea is that it is a somewhat different system for national security because of how it affects our country at such a deep, visceral level, right? Versus a crime, which is as horrific as it is a limited set of people that it's affecting.
Now,
right?
how does FISA work when it is, say, a member of AQ or a ancillary of that, because they're not a government?
Yeah, so it was crazy. You basically had to connect someone back to Osama bin Laden, like literally, like connect this person knows this person knows this person knows this person, and then so there was once that had been done, you had to just connect it to the 10 people at the bottom. If you had a new guy, and okay, he's gotten recruited by this person, but then basically every court application had to show that it was going through the entire line of all these people.
Wow.
So it was a little bit of a difficult system at that time. There's been some changes that make it a lot easier now, but it was that in terms of the kind of bureaucracy that the Bureau has to work through to do its job. That's one of the layers that makes it very difficult. So.
And I mean, I imagine it's challenging because when you're dealing with non-nation state actors, that can start to move. If we were to take the IRA, they're not a non-state actor, right? And then you say that a person's part of that or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It could be abused, right? If you just say, because there's Al-Qaeda's not putting out their membership list, right? It's not on their website. You can't look at our team, right, and click on that and find the whole list of people, right, in a similar way. So, if you don't, they want to make sure that there are rigorous rules surrounding how you know who's in that membership, right? Because it's a pretty significant powers, right, to be able to go and get into someone's privacy. People don't want that to happen. So there should be a high hurdle for that, and there is.
For the folks out there watching, I appreciate you guys joining us tonight. I just want to give a quick shout out actually to our podcast, our live stream here. There's a link down in the description to our Patreon page if you want to get all these episodes ad-free without any advertisements.
So, Jack, are you saying our sponsor tonight is the fine people watching this show?
Yes.
Join our Patreon.
Viewers like you. Tell us then about making the jump from counterterrorism to counterintelligence.
Yeah, so a couple things. I mean, just life. I mean, one, we were, as I said, we were kind of going pretty hard for a couple of years and wanted to do something that was a bit more regular. We started having kids and, wanted to be around and be a full parent participant in every way. And then we also had a pretty major change that was going on at the Bureau with regards to intelligence. So, after 9/11, one of the big things that changed was how the Bureau used intelligence. And we don't have to go into the detail, but just at a broad level, it was the Bureau's always used intelligence, but it's been basically sort of a you eat what you kill, right? You develop intelligence for your case in order to go after your particular person, your group, and go for an indictment, and that's what your intelligence serves. There was not a whole lot of sharing of that intelligence to other people because if it didn't affect their case, they didn't need to know it. But what changed after 9/11 is people realized that the FBI was working on a number of matters, certainly in the counterterrorism world, that information would be incredibly important, not only for other cases in the Bureau, but other members of the intelligence community. So needed a way to figure out how do you pull this information out of the cases, how do you aggregate it together, and then put it into products that then you share with the rest of the community. And so that was a really, it sounds very simplistic when I talk about it, but it was a major shift. So I got pulled into helping doing that to kind of complete that. We started in New York. This is when Mueller was still the director, trying to make that shift, and started to really enjoy, and we did intelligence and counterterrorism, but it was a little bit different, but started to really kind of enjoy the sort of the process, the art of it, and started thinking about, I wanted to be a supervisor, so I became a supervisor of a counterintelligence squad at that time. I was pretty new. I had about 4 years in the Bureau, so it was, they made a rule right after that you had to have 6 years after me, so I don't know if I should take that personally or not, but anyway, I think I did a good job, and did that for a couple of years, but really enjoyed it. I was working on a country that has to remain nameless, but they had a burgeoning nuclear program, to say that. So they had a lot of individuals coming over, looking to get information to build up. Essentially, they were doing proliferation work, and so there was actually it was a great transition because within counterterrorism, there was a lot of counterproliferation work as well as concern about Al Qaeda or other groups trying to get their hands on nuclear weapons or nuclear material to make a dirty bomb, radiological device, and very similar sort of on the state actor side. And so it was a good kind of transition there.
I imagine that this being a major, metropolitan, very cosmopolitan city, but also with the United Nations here, it must be mayhem for you guys and the stuff you got to deal with.
So it's really, it is. I mean, and what's crazy, and I don't know if everyone appreciates is, so, the United States and New York are the hosts of the United Nations. And so in some ways, but the missions that are here are being hosted by the UN. So while they have to have U.S. visas in order to enter the United States, their host is really the United Nations itself. And that may just sound like kind of a strange, kind of a weird nuance, but it makes a difference, right? Versus someone who is so the mission to the UN of, say the Russian mission to the UN versus, say, the Russian consulate up here, right? Which is, which its relationship is to the United States. It makes the U.S. government step a little bit more carefully, and with good reason, right? We're the host here, so if we're kicking everyone out all the time, how can we have the United Nations here if you're just because someone is from, say, North Korea or wherever else, how can we kind of have them here? But that adds an extra layer of complication because obviously, anytime they start doing something horrible, as some of these countries do, and then when you want to, you're doing an investigation and you want to PNG them, declare them persona non grata because you can't arrest them because they're on a diplomatic visa. There is a whole dance with essentially the UN, right? Because it's affecting the politics up there, right? And so if the U.S. happens to be in a intense negotiation with that country on a particular committee at the time that you want to take law enforcement action, it can be difficult.
And you told us that you opened up Operation Encore. Can you tell us about that?
I did, yeah. So that was back when I was still on the counterterrorism side. So that came out, President Biden released a bit about the case on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And essentially it was an intelligence effort to really uncover, to look deeper into potential support of the 9/11 hijackers by the Saudi Arabian government. And so I was on a squad that still had what was called Pent Bomb, which was the Bureau's case for all of the events that had happened during 9/11. It was mostly sort of a repository to run the prosecutions. But as I started looking into it, there was information in there that, as the investigators had gone through it, they'd done a wonderful job at uncovering all this, but they'd been really focused on, all right, let's get these guys, let's move prosecution forward. Who do we need to take out immediate sort of threats? The idea was, let's go back through this again, and let's see, are there things that not that we missed, but that are worth a longer look, because were they secondary, tertiary connections? Maybe it didn't seem like as big of a deal now, but maybe it was more important at the time. And so that's one of the things that we looked at pretty closely there.
And what kind of conclusions came out of that investigation?
So unfortunately, viewers, the case is still classified. But what came out of it, I would say, is that in some ways is more questions than answers. There was a large amount of activity, I think, just writ large, of individuals who had either close or loose associations with the Saudi government that were kind of in this realm, as the document that got released kind of talks about. And at the time, and this is just my personal opinion, let me just be clear about this part of it. The Saudi government didn't, the right hand didn't necessarily know what the left hand was doing at all times. It's a very large government, and there were some concerns that there could be pieces of this that weren't fully understood by them. And so that was sort of what the effort was, kind of looking at that. But it was again, it was super interesting, and it took me all over the world for a while, checking into a lot of things that had happened previously and talking to people and trying to really narrow down and understand sort of the trajectory that the 9/11 hijackers had taken. And were there other individuals we could identify that were, and even more important than the individuals, were there techniques that they used that could be used again, right? And so that was kind of my biggest concern, was less sometimes the network that could have been plugged into, but like a methodology that they used, right? So this is like the A team that got inserted and that, kind of ran circles around, or ran straight through, rather, all of our security apparatus. And could that happen again, right, if you had a similar one? And certainly there were things that we saw in there that needed to be tightened up, and that was a really positive part of it, and say, hey, look, they did this, someone else could do this again, it's not as good as it could be. And so that was, I think, some good results out of that.
So in your personal opinion, was there a faction or a branch of the Saudi government or Saudi intelligence apparatus that offered some level of support to the 9/11 hijackers?
I honestly don't know, and I would say if I think, in my personal opinion, if I could give you one, I would. I will say that, and the reason I don't know is I never came across any definitive information that made it clear that there was. There were individuals that we read about, and one of them, they were thought to be potential intelligence officers of associated with the Saudi government. It was unclear if they were working at the behest of the Saudis or their own. And I think part of the issue was this is the counterintelligence world, right? Trying to disaggregate, all right, who's running their own operations for their own organizations, and they just happen to be using government resources, right? And that part was always very difficult to disaggregate. And I never saw it. I never saw a clear, command and control, so-and-so who was appointed and did this, told them to do that. That I never saw.
How hard is it in the modern age, like what you're talking about, sort of the nuance with these nation states and then their governments, people acting in? I mean, in the 1800s, some of the acts committed against us now would be considered an act of war. Yeah. But like you talk about the UN and trying to diplomatically PNG somebody, where, like, as a federal law enforcement agent, how do you deal with those things? Do people come down on you and say, this is how we have to handle this? Do you raise it up the flag and say, hey, this is the situation and we know what the relationship is with this country?
Yeah, it certainly comes in, because it's a great question, because I think the Bureau deals with a lot of specific sort of threats, right, to people or to a particular situation. But often the implication of us arresting someone who's at the Russian embassy or the Russian consulate or the Russian mission at the UN, for example, or any of those, it has huge political implications, right? So you think of ghost stories, which was the Russian illegals that were running around here, and the Bureau had a long investigation on it. In the end, a lot of those guys got traded, right? Got sent back, and we got back people that we wanted to get back. And I think that part of the Bureau on the counterintelligence side understands that that's part of the game, because that part has always been much more sort of closely associated with the intelligence community. It's less well understood probably on the counterterrorism criminal side of the Bureau, because it's just not how things work on that side. You don't trade people in that way. that there's always some tension there, and you certainly get people who kind of come back and forth and like, what, we're doing this, and I don't care whose agency wants us to do this. It's helpful to whatever part of government. Like, this is a bad guy. So my years, going after him, he should go to jail. He should do whatever, this kind of thing. But it's at least for a while, it was a very different game. That's changing to some degree, especially as you've got places like China and others doing more of sort of on the economic espionage side, where we are arresting intelligence officers. Right, there was a recent case, a guy named Xu Yanjun. He's a Ministry of State Security intelligence officer. And he was extradited from Belgium, which was pretty amazing, and back into the United States. And previously, that's not something that people would want us to do. Maybe people are wondering why. The idea is if you just think about the number of intelligence officers that the United States government might have, and that they might be sort of breaking laws of other countries because they're trying to collect, essential, critical piece of intelligence for the United States. They don't want to be arrested and then put into jail, right? Because it typically is someone gets arrested and they get deported, and that's kind of it, right? But this is potentially it's changed the game a little bit to where, again, we talk about barriers breaking down between foreign and domestic. The idea of law enforcement and sort of you think about like Title 18 and in intel side of things, there's much more of a blending now, and the Bureau is comfortable kind of flipping back and forth. Some other agencies are less comfortable doing that. There's a few that kind of straddle both. So,
and were there times either for you personally or for people that you knew that when like they were shut down for something that was just very frustrating?
All the time. And some of that, it may not have been anything nefarious, but it happens, right? They're just, we're told don't dig into this farther, let this one go. And you don't ever know sometimes. Sometimes it's because some other agency has something going on.
Right.
And you think it's like, hey, I'm right in the middle of this. I'm about to blow it wide open. And it's like, no. This is an operation that they set up. They've been running for 6 years, and you're about to screw the whole thing up. Right. And so that happens. The other side happens too, right? Like when you've been running an operation, all of a sudden someone shows up, and you're like, that guy is just a little bit too smart for someone else. And so you go talk to someone across the river and say, hey, do you guys happen to be running an operation? And then that guy never shows up. They say no, but of course that guy never shows up again. And so anyway, that we do some sort of deconfliction that way, and occasionally it happens a lot more. And there's a lot more sort of cross jobs that the Bureau works at other parts of the IC, and other parts of the IC work at the Bureau. NSA comes in, CIA, we flip back and forth. So there's a lot more closer understanding of how we work and like the powers that each one of them has, and that I think is really basically when the Bureau and the agency, and then if you can put the NSA in there, when they work together, it's really an unstoppable team. The amount of sort of resources they can pull to it, and I think we do that a lot better than we used to, and that's really kind of I think the standard at this point. Where traditionally in movies we're always fighting with each other. That doesn't happen as much anymore.
You mean it's not like in the movies where like the station chief throws his latte across the room into the window?
I'm sure that happens occasionally. But those guys on both the agency and the Bureau side get disciplined pretty quickly, because that creates some pretty bad blood pretty fast. But yeah, that was the old way, right? There was a lot of hatred on both sides, and the Bureau thinks all agency people are liars, and the agency people think the Bureau people are knuckle draggers, right? And so that sort of rhetoric back and forth, kind of continues. So
the next place you landed was Moscow.
Yeah.
Why did the FBI send you to Moscow? What was your job there?
Basically, no one else wanted to go. So, no. I'm only partially kidding. So I came in under the Bureau had kind of different designations. So I spoke Russian and then had law, and so that came in under that program. So I thought I'd be working Russian CI, and so instead I'd get doing like Arabian Peninsula terrorism, trying to learn Arabic and stuff. So it's typical government sort of puts you into different roles, and no matter what your skill set. But I'd kept up the Russian, and so wanted to go. And again, most of the time people go overseas once they're in the later part of their career, because it's kind of in a sense, sort of a reward, right? And you have your long in the tooth, and you can talk about these things. I'd only had 6 years in at this point, but again, people don't want to go to Moscow because it's not a relationship that worked, right? So the Bureau overseas, it's not like a station chief. We're not running operations. We're liaising and we're cooperating to do investigations with them. So if the relationship's crap, there's not a lot of work to do, right? You go to the UK, you're working closely with with MI5, you're working closely with Scotland Yard to do all these great operations. People really enjoy that. If you're in Moscow, you're working with the FSB and all of those fun guys. For me, that was what I wanted to do, because I was like, that's a place you can have an impact, a place that doesn't function, where you can really kind of move the needle. Because my thinking was, you could be a total jerk in London, and they're still going to work with you, because they're not going to screw up the relationship. Mm-hmm. But in Moscow, it might matter if you spoke Russian, if you understand them a little bit, if you could talk to them about things or why certain things mattered or why they didn't. And so that's what really kind of drew me to being over there. And despite the horrible things that are happening there now, I'd been exchange student there twice. I'd had a host family there. I had great affinity for the culture and for the people. The government is a totally different story, obviously. And so I thought it'd be fun to go back and then expose my kids to it as well.
So I'm really interested to hear from you as somebody who has, boots on the ground, so to speak, interacting and working, liaisoning with Russian intelligence services, to go beyond the caricatures in the movies and the spy novels and even what we read in newspapers is often limited in second or third hand information. Really interested in like the character and the culture and what these guys are like as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, some stereotypes live up to it. I mean,
the drinking?
Yeah, I mean, that part is pretty rough. I mean, thankfully I'd had some experience and kind of understood how that worked. I mean, there's that's a big part of it. And there's they're so blatant about this stuff. So we had they had a security and intelligence services like conference in Kazan. It's a city sort of south of or to the east and south of Moscow, and it was all these intelligence, all the liaison services that were there in Moscow working with the FSB, and every night at the hotel, the FSB would bring in about 20 prostitutes and just, send them around to talk to people. And so I asked, I was like, really, does this, why are you doing this? This is just ridiculous. Like, does anyone fall for this? Or like, we wouldn't do it if people weren't falling for this. And so, I mean, these sort of tried and true techniques of sacks of cash and sex, and those they absolutely work. And that's why the Russians continue to do them. And so they live up to that stereotype in terms of, people get into all sorts of trouble and have romantic relationships, and then they think it's going great, and then they show up and someone says, the girlfriend says, well, I want you to meet Uncle Sasha, and you come in and Uncle Sasha's got pictures of you, but don't worry, we're all going to make the pictures go away. We just need this. That's all we need, one thing, and it starts with one thing, and then it kind of continues on. And so, I mean, that part is pretty stereotypical, and it tends to work.
How many times did they pitch you while you were there?
So I never got pitched. So if you get pitched, it becomes a big deal. But yeah, I mean, it usually means that they are, because if you're declared, if they pitch you, it can generally mean one of two things. One, they want to send you home because they don't like you. Uh-huh. Because once that happens, U.S. government's like, all right, we're not going to let this potentially play out.
Walk
so
around.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
Or two, they think that there's some reason you might say yes, right? And so, it's not ever a good position unless you purposely are messing with them, that they want to do that. So no, I mean, I had, I think, what was the kind of the constant sort of, trying to make me see their way of thinking about things.
Sure.
So I think, as I mentioned to you, I was over in Moscow during, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And so the Tsarnaev brothers' parents were actually in Dagestan, which is a republic in the south, near where I had been as an exchange student. And so we actually started doing some very close work with them. We were trying to figure out, the Tsarnaev brothers had spent a lot of time, or the summer before, in Dagestan, and there was a concern that they had been radicalized or trained, or maybe there were more people with them. So all these sort of typical things that you go through in a terrorism investigation, trying to determine what they were doing. And so we're working with the FSB to try to figure this out. And they set us up with an individual who had, in many ways had, sort of dusting off scraping the blood off his boots, because he had just come back from, several tours and down in the Caucasus, and he was a extremely personable guy, and he just spent time talking to me about their position and their thinking about things of the world. And look, it's always really fascinating to hear from my perspective because it helps me get into their head, how they're seeing things. I don't find it particularly persuasive. It was helpful to have been an exchange student there to like know the other side of a lot of these things. My host family was they were Russian culturally, but my host mother was Armenian, the father was Ukrainian, and so they had a very different perspective on sort of Russian imperial sort of activity. But one of the things he always talked about, and many of them talked about, they wanted to emphasize that they're in a rough neighborhood, and it's not like the United States where you've got two oceans and two fairly friendly neighbors on your border. And this guy and this general that I talked to a lot, he wanted to emphasize that he was like, as much as it seems peaceful now, things can change. This is something they talked to me about a lot because they would argue about NATO and expansion of NATO and all these things. I was like, you guys are ridiculous. Like, NATO is not trying to take over Russia. It's the last thing we want. You can have your, gas station masquerading as a country. We don't want it. Like, it's all yours. And their response was, yeah, we really don't believe that you want it. But, in 1932, Nazi Germany was a basket case. It could barely feed its people. By 1936, it was the strongest military in Europe and possibly the world. Things change, and we have to be ready. So their perspective is NATO might be quiet, or at least back then, just what they were painting to me was that might not be doing anything, but if they ever let it get to a place where it could take over Russia, then they're in a position where, an untenable position, right, from a national security standpoint. And as much as crazy as that might seem to us, that have never happened, that's their perspective. Again, I'm not trying to defend it, but I think it's important to understand that they really do believe this.
That's the zeitgeist of the Russian security apparatus. Is the sort of national trauma from World War II that carries through.
Yep. And rightfully so. I mean, they paid a horrible price, in World War II.
They did. I mean, and query whether they paid a horrible price by the famine that they caused in Ukraine before as well.
Right. I'm definitely not justifying them at all.
Absolutely not. No, and I didn't mean to imply that, but I think there's it's a mess of things, and they did pay as a people a horrible price for it. And I think it changes their mentality in the sense of like what they're dealing with. And again, I think it's really important where I hear on the news and the perspectives and vilifying Putin and everyone else, and that's fine. I mean, I think Putin could be vilified, and it's incredibly accurate. But I think it's important to understand that at least the you want to call it propaganda, you want to call it the narrative, whatever that the people believe in and what they see there is often very different than what we're hearing. And so, while there are certain people who are they're worldly and cosmopolitan enough to recognize that is not the full story, the vast majority of the people in the country don't. They see it. They have the propaganda every day. They hear this, and this is their perspective on the world.
Right.
And so, in terms of thinking about where things are going with Russia, I think it's important to know that it's not just Putin who feels this way. There's a lot of
when you hear the stories from some of these recently liberated areas of Ukraine and what the Ukrainian civilians are saying, how they interact with the Russian soldiers, and the Russians are like, why are you upset? Like, we're here to save you from the Nazis.
Yeah.
Like, they whole ass believe the propaganda, at least many of them.
Absolutely. And for the Russians, the way they think about Nazis and Nazism is a bit different than the way we define it. And so, and we have, it's kind of an academic sort of piece of it, but they really do believe that it's, in a sense that the U.S. is sort of Nazifying this place, right?
Is that like anything that's an external threat is quote unquote Nazis? I mean, what is that in their minds?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, the idea of a fascist government from the outside, that's Nazism, right? And so, I mean, it's gotten a little bit crazy where they even talked about de-Satanization at this point.
Recently,
yeah. So, but I mean, there's something to this in terms of World War II was a very different experience for them, and they call it the Great Patriotic War, right? For the U.S., it's like, it's just the Second World War we were in, right? And so it's a very different experience, and they think about it in a very different way. Again, not to say that it's right by any means, but I think that the perspective of the Russian people on this is very different.
It's always like we're on the precipice of something.
Yeah, I mean, they think chaos is around the corner.
And you were also there when the Edward Snowden affair happened. and you had to interact with FSB and some of the other Russian agencies about that whole debacle. What was that like from your perspective?
Frustrating. I mean, he was at Sheremetyevo, like one of the main airports in Moscow, for a couple weeks, and I kept asking for permission to go to, because I assumed I could probably find him, right? He's in some room somewhere. But obviously we were talking to them about, hey, look, this is on the tail end of having great cooperation after the Boston Marathon bombing, and this was gonna just tank the whole thing. But it became clear to me that like they had no interest in changing the trajectory of the relationship. Not that they wanted it to necessarily go south, but in their mind, the U.S. has been conducting, these operations around the world with other countries that have, diminished their security. And obviously Snowden was just a great tool for kind of bringing that out, right? And so they wanted to highlight all the sort of, in their mind, the hypocrisy within the United States government, right? And they want to be able to undermine it because they don't want the U.S. essentially causing a color revolution in Russia.
Right.
They saw some of the things that happened in Central Asia. They saw what happened in the Arab Spring. And in their mind, that's chaos. And they believe that that's what the U.S. is intentionally doing around the world with its democracy spreading, right? They talk about the spread of democracy is almost as bad as the U.S. military.
And like 1991 is like an era in Russian history like none of them want to go back to.
Exactly. No, and they're very upset about the lands that were lost. It's funny going back to when I was an exchange student there. I used to talk to school and family, and it was 1993, and I was like, hey, if you're interested in democracy, I'm happy to tell you about it. And they're like, no, we just want to know how to make money. Like, they're not interested in this democracy nonsense. And so, I think we sort of misinterpreted, with a lot of hope that the fall of the Soviet Union would bring about a democratization in Russia and a change in the way that they deal with things. But it really, if anything, they were just biding their time. They did not have the power to push back on us. But once they did, they started to with great abandon. So,
and so, what was your interface like at that time with FSB? I mean, what was it you or us as Americans? What was our government trying to get from the Russians in regards to Snowden versus what the Russians were willing to give up? Like, were you guys trying to get him back, trying to extradite him?
I mean, we were just talking about how bad it was going to be for the relationship too, and that despite sort of all the commentary of like, oh, he did this on his own and it wasn't an operation, where like it looks like anything but it looks like everything, it looks like exactly an operation. This is how it would go, and just talk to them about how it would hurt the relationship, and it did. It ultimately cratered everything, and then we had soon after that was the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And just everything went off the rails after that. Not my fault, totally. It was while I was there, but yeah, I mean, it was those. It went from a fairly sort of good working relationship with them on particular things, and some things opened up after the Boston Marathon bombing, to everything very quickly closing down, where they just sort of changed. And I interpret it a little bit as we had maybe made some progress with our counterparts in terms of like, all right, maybe there's a few areas we can, we have some mutually, I'm not saying they were like, oh, well, we should help the Americans. That was never part of it. It was like, all right, well, maybe we have our interests overlap in a couple other areas. But once sort of the top was kind of like, all right, well, that's nice. Stop playing around. This is the direction we're going to go. And it became very clear it was a very different sort of kind of trajectory after that.
I've talked to CIA people in the past who they speak of it as kind of tragic, but also and if they feel like, or at least some people feel that it's like the Russians are trying to remain relevant in our eyes. Like they're doing things to keep up on our radar, which is a little simplistic. I mean, is there some of that, or is this really there's a sort of imperialistic ambitions of Russia to secure their near abroad? I mean, how do you interpret it?
No, I mean, look, it's hard to be in the head of every single Russian, right?
Sure.
It's a huge country, 100 and however many, 40 million, 20 million, something, wherever it currently is with the population shrinking. But there is again, a narrative. They have a messianic view of themselves, right? This gets really deep into sort of the rhetoric. They call themselves the Third Rome. Moscow's the third Rome. So first Rome being Rome, second Rome being Byzantium, and Constantinople, and basically when there was the schism, and then when that place went to crap and was totally corrupt, then Moscow became the true center of Christianity. And so there is a belief system that Russia is going to sort of protect the world with their vision of how things should work. I'm not saying everybody has that view, but that is kind of a part and parcel of how Russia kind of sees itself in the world. So I mean, I think in many ways, the 14 new countries that came out of the Soviet Union, some of which had existed before, to be clear, the Russians see that as traditional Russian lands. I mean, obviously, it's kind of, where do you draw the line? If it's 200 years ago, it's Russian. If it's 1,000 years ago, it's Mongol. So maybe they want it back. But so it gets a little bit confusing. But obviously, they draw the lines at a certain place and say these are traditional Russian lands, and we should have them back.
Right.
And they're an insecure state.
Tradition from this state to this state. Right.
Right. As my Italian friend said, he's like, look, it was all Roman originally. We want it all back. So,
right.
So maybe.
Well, like Lithuania had a huge chunk of it at one point in history.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe the Vikings should get it back. I don't know. I mean, they were the ones going down the Volga and populating that area to begin with. So, I mean, it gets a little bit, kind of silly and to have that sort of academic argument. But I don't think it's kind of irrelevant because whatever it is, they believe that those lands are theirs.
It's real to them.
Right.
And they need it, right?
Right.
And so I think it's an important thing to remember, whether you agree with it or not, think it's crazy. When we are thinking about what we're doing vis-a-vis Ukraine, how's that going to play out with regards to Russia, I think it's important to understand that there is a not insignificant part of their population on the other side who is ready to go to the end with this.
Right.
And what does that mean for how this plays out with us, right? We don't want to escalate. We don't want to lose the war. We're going to keep it in some crazy limbo for 5, 10, 15 years. I mean, anyway, I'm not really sure how this plays out.
Right.
Because at some point, we're dealing with a group of people who in some ways have nothing to lose.
Right.
Right. So that makes a totally different kind of set of decisions.
And not just have something to lose, but even though they are a Christian culture, my impression is that Russians share sort of a fatalistic worldview in the same way that a lot of Muslim cultures do. That
they're certainly very fatalistic. Yeah, I mean, that is a quality about how and this kind of gets to the point of worldviews. I basically I went to Russia as an exchange student and didn't know any Russian. I knew 5 words. I knew yes, no, maybe, toilet, and shower. I think that was pretty much it. So basically learned sitting around the kitchen talking to my host mother the whole time, and we would have all sorts of discussions about the world. And I was 18, and I'd been to like a border town in Mexico, and that was the extent of my world travels at that point. And then now in the south of Russia, talking about this stuff. But it was really an eye-opening experience, because clearly the things I was expressing, optimism, faith in the ability, human ingenuity to solve problems, for life to improve. Basically, very American views, right? This is part of the American experience because this is what we have been able to do by and large for a number of different reasons, right? But that hasn't been the Russian experience. So informed by history and very fatalistic of like, look, things are going to fall apart. There's going to be chaos, and you need a strong government in order to kind of keep the chaos at bay. And what is the United States doing? They're just churning up more and more chaos outside.
There is a great Adam Curtis documentary that just came out, Trauma Zone.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's like 8 parts, and it's old BBC footage.
Oh, wow.
From like 1975 through the collapse. And I mean, every American should really go and watch that because it's just so fascinating. It lends this insight into everything from like Yeltsin and Gorbachev, but also down to like Babushka taking the spuds out of the basement and traveling to her sister's house, hitchhiking there and then cooking up the mashed potatoes. I mean, it's just like a very fascinating insight into Russian culture and political history. But I would like to shift gears. A similar but separate conversation to your time in Beijing.
Yeah.
What was it? They said, "Hey, you did a knock-up job in Russia. We're sending you over to Beijing."
Thanks for ruining that relationship.
Yeah,
Can you
thanks
go
for blowing that one, Holden.
Yeah. So it was. I mean, Beijing is very similar to Moscow. It's not a desirable place. It's not a Paris or Moscow or a Paris or like London for FBI agents. And I thought, I think because I did a good job in Moscow and in terms of, so I applied and I was lucky enough. So I ran the office in Beijing for 3 years. Got there at the end of 2014 and then left the summer of 2017. So a little under 3 years.
So same sort of question, interacting with the Chinese security state.
Yeah.
It is something, and we were talking earlier about Matthew Brazil and Peter Mattis's
Yep.
very, very good book,
Yeah, absolutely.
Chinese Communist Espionage. It's a sort of historical accounting, but I feel like we just have so few contemporary accounts or views or any sort of lens into the Chinese security apparatus, the Chinese security services,
Yeah.
and I was wondering if you could talk to us about that.
Sure. It was, so our main interlocutor there was the Ministry of Public Security, which generally is thought of as, when people think of like Chinese law enforcement police or whatever. But actually, as that book notes, up until 1983, they ran counterintelligence within the country, and they ran a lot of the intelligence operations. In fact, one of the first spies to come over to the United States was run by MPS. And because of the sort of digitization police state that they run, they collect a lot of intelligence. So they work very closely with the Ministry of State Security, who we also met with on a less frequent basis, just because of the work that we were doing. So my job was to work with them and to try to find areas to cooperate. And it was hard. It was really hard because in so many ways, we just did not see eye to eye. I'd spent a little bit of time in China. After you take the bar, you take a bar trip. I went to Beijing for 4 months back in 2003, but it had been a long time, but not nearly the same level of kind of knowledge and background that I had of Russia. And so I had less of a basis to kind of, language as well to build up. And, there's some significant differences. Obviously every people are different, right? But just in sort of trying to contrast the two of them, since we are dealing with them and are in the focus. But, in some ways where we would disagree with the Russians about, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like the facts of or we would have an argument. But in general, we could agree on the facts. We weren't totally off. But sometimes I feel like when I was talking to the MPS and the Chinese, we were just having totally different conversations about things. They approach it in our relationship in a very transactional way. And I'll give you a really very horrific example of that. So because of the poor state of cooperation with both Russia and China, typically, it's hard to work a lot of cases because they have sort of a political aspect to it. Everything does, right? It's an impact. So you often work matters that kind of have a visceral sort of reaction. And so one of them we work a lot are child sex crimes or child exploitation cases. And we work those with the Russians pretty frequently. Give them information about individuals who were creating materials, who were on forums and abusing kids, this type of thing. So really horrific stuff. And we never had any issues that the Russians, they would respond. Sometimes they'd respond a little too hard with them, right?
The RDM running over the house.
Yeah. so occasionally those things would happen. But it was, they would respond. We had an individual that we were dealing with regards to MPS. He was an American at a school in China. And it was one of these, quote, international schools. But the only thing international about it was the teachers. The students were all locals. And we had information that he was essentially... The horrible thing about some of these forums is that you don't get into them unless you're creating original material.
Yeah, they call them producers.
Yeah. And that creates a huge barrier for the Bureau and others, right? Because obviously you cannot create anything. So there's a process of basically trying to, kind of get into these.
With the Aussies.
Yeah.
It's come out.
Anyway, I don't know what has or has. I'll let it go. But because it's great and really important work, and but we had good reason to believe that this guy was creating material based on his access to students at this school, and so we asked for. I said, "Hey, can you deal with this?" I said, and they're like, "Well, what would you like?" And I was like, "You can deport him. We'll arrest him on site.
Yeah.
You can arrest him. There's enough information on here to show you what he's done in China. and put him into one of your dungeons for whatever amount of time is by your laws. He's violated your laws in your country. That's up to you. I said, but can we just please
deal with it?
Can we get this guy out of the public? So they turned into me and then passed 3 names to me of individuals who were part of their anti-corruption campaign. And said, well, we want these 3 people. I said, I'm sorry, you're trying to trade these people? That's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to trade people that were part of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption fox hunt trade for this individual. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm not empowered. This is not my, we make decisions based on facts and information, and then we follow the cases. This is how it works, which they did not believe that's how it worked. They saw it as purely transactional. So this went back and forth for probably a year before they actually...
So they wouldn't arrest this guy who'd broken their laws because you wanted to arrest him and wouldn't make the political trade.
They wanted, so you may be familiar, they've had this long-term campaign they've called Fox Hunt. Skynet is another one, which I know is the Terminator thing. I'm not sure why they picked that, so they need a better marketing team. Anyway, but it's basically these individuals who had various connections to quote-unquote corrupt politicians in China and had then absconded to the United States, the UK, Australia, and other places, and they were searching for them and trying to get them back. And they wanted us to just deport them and send them back. As it turns out, it's much more of a political consolidation campaign because, surprise, surprise, everyone's corrupt in China, and so just the fact that you are corrupt doesn't mean that you need to be arrested. It's only if you've also you're outside of Xi's patronage network.
Right.
So anyway, they were wanting essentially a political move for what was law enforcement. Anyway, it took a long time to move this thing forward, but it just gives you an idea of, and this is, we talk about this a lot, the Ministry of Public Security, at the end of the day, they are a security service with a political mission.
Right.
If you want to think about public security, they are keeping the party secure from the public. Mm-hmm. That's their job. And so they espouse these sort of what they call, kind of traditional Chinese values of harmony and other things, but it's just sort of nonsense. They think of this stuff as just a way to kind of keep control.
Letting a pedophile loose on a schoolhouse isn't exactly maintaining harmony.
No. And that's, at the end of the day, this stuff is where they're not putting resources towards it. It was going to be potentially embarrassing that because they hadn't picked it up and they hadn't dealt with it. And it's just not something that they think of as important. The ideas of justice and enforcing laws, these are not the priorities for them. Ensuring that the public is kind of placid and following the rules and doing what they're supposed to be doing and not challenging the state, that's what they're supposed to be doing. And so that made it very difficult to where there was less and less that we could even do, and it was just this constant dance of ensuring that they weren't pulling information out of us to try to use against us or to try to figure out what we were doing vis-a-vis other things, and it became a much more of a difficult relationship.
It's sounding incredibly cynical.
It was, and this is, it kind of topped off with the Xi-Obama agreement in 2015 on cyber. This is right after the OPM hack, and obviously everyone was up in arms about that. And then, they signed an agreement saying they would no longer, conduct espionage for commercial gain anymore, which was total nonsense. Of course, they may have slowed down a little bit in a few areas, but they just ramped it up in others and went at it in a really different way. And we sort of were trying to work out that agreement, but it was completely cynical, even just the negotiations with them, and it was clear they had no intention of moving forward, of even fulfilling even the basic parts of it. And so in my mind, it just became a matter of, all right, how can I record this, make data for this, so that people in the future can be like, we cannot cooperate with them on this. They have no desire to do it, and so we don't have. So what we had at the time is everyone's like, well, we have to try. We haven't tried before, and it's like, oh, we've tried. It just never went anywhere.
Right.
And so, but there wasn't the type of open documentation that people could look at. So that's what I kind of spent a lot of my time, is just requests and ensuring that it was clearly documented what they didn't do, and how they were not fulfilling their end of the agreement, and how it was being used for other purposes. And that became helpful when I got to the White House and we started to focus on kind of policy towards China and thinking about shifting it. And it was a major U.S. shift. But it's such a long process to do that. But
were there any areas that you found where you were able to cooperate in a somewhat productive manner on security issues?
No. I was trying to think. There were a few who are like, "Wow, this wasn't so bad." And I mean, the problem was, and this is, I think we have a tendency to think of, be it the Russians, the Chinese, are 10 feet tall, they never make mistakes, and that's not the case at all. They have some very capable parts of their services, but they're also a massively corrupt place. And so some of the things that we try to work with them, and we try to work with their, where we needed them to go get information from their banks, like they essentially kind of tell us, hey, our banks are a total mess. They don't even they can't even keep compliant. I'm not talking about the big four ones there. And so it was just, they couldn't even do basic investigations because they couldn't get information out of their banking system to see sort of financial information. So at least not consistently. So
Do you feel as though they see us in some ways with law enforcement not as toothless because we do abide the letter of the law and international law for the most part?
I actually think they think that that's total BS, that we actually don't. I think the Russians and Chinese believe this, that we can do whatever we want.
Right.
And that stuff is just pure subterfuge, put
They've
out
seen
there.
Jason Bourne. They know how it works, man.
Well, I think it's that, but it's also the idea of if the U.S. is that powerful, what country in their right mind would actually restrain their power, right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
have this. I mean, especially think about after World War II, the U.S. had. I mean, there's crazy estimates where 60 to 80% of all industrial production was in the U.S. We could have just taken over the entire world if we wanted to, right?
Right.
And we didn't. We restrained ourselves for a number of reasons, but they can't imagine that because that's not how they operate. If they have the power to do something, they're going to use it.
Right.
And so the idea that the U.S. has this power and doesn't use it because we are principled and we have rules and regulations, it just does not compute.
So by their math, though, does that mean that they don't think we're very powerful? We have the power and we don't use it. So which one of those things aren't true?
So we have the power and we won't use it for them to help them, right?
Right.
Essentially the things that they want. And but there's also, we have corruption, we have other issues.
Sure.
And so sometimes that may be influencing why we're not using that power. But I think in their mind, we are using it, right? We could blockade China today, right? And we could block out all oil and gas from getting into, or all oil at least, coming into the coast of China. And they would have major economic consequences today. They know that, right? This is why they focus on Taiwan and other things, the first island chain, get out. But I think in their mind, they're well, they're not going to do this, and they're a paper tiger, they're weak. Even if they have this power, they're not using it. That just means that they're weak in their heart, rather than thinking it's principled or it's, again, as we were talking about, we don't want tyranny in this country, so we limit the power of the government.
Did you find that that there's a belief that they believe all sorts of conspiracy theories about what we're trying to do to them? In the Middle East, for example, I've come across many times, people think we created ISIS. You're so powerful. If you don't like ISIS, you just send Bruce Willis to wipe them out. What doesn't make sense? Daesh? That's CIA.
Right.
What people actually around the world believe stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I do. I think they have a lot of conspiracy. I mean, some of the stuff that they see online, I think they absolutely believe about the U.S. government. I'm trying to think of anything specific could point to, but no, I mean, I think that a lot of this stuff, they have a hard time understanding how our system works. And I think it's just, you talk to people who have immigrated here, and it does take some time to get it around your head that no, the police really are limited in what they can do, and they have to follow the rules. And yes, and that doesn't mean that there aren't mistakes and all sorts of problems. I don't want to ignore other parts of the country that need work, right? We're a project, and we're continuing to work on it, right?
There are people everywhere that are going to abuse whatever they're a part of.
Right.
That's just
absolutely
human nature.
But by and large, the difference between how our law enforcement works here versus theirs, it's night and day. And so, I mean, I think that there's pieces of this that they cannot figure it out, and so the conspiracy theories come in, and they're happy to believe those if that's how that works, or who knows, all this stuff that kind of comes into it. But I think also part of it is because those types of crazy theories, they actually, some of that stuff really does happen there, right? Because it's a you've got these secret societies and these places that are very closed off, and
palace coups and
exactly. The U.S. can't keep any secrets. Everything gets leaked. There's no. This is why I love these conspiracy theories about the U.S. of crazy, like in the center, someone running some secret cabal to like run the government. Are you kidding? Someone would leak that to the Times like tomorrow. Like that would immediately be out there. Like we can't keep secrets for any amount of time. But anyway, I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how we operate, and I think in some ways we have a pretty big misunderstanding of them. People tend to see them through their own prism of like, oh well, they'd love to be like us if they if they could and do these things, and they really don't want to be.
Right.
And in some ways, I'm not sure if our system would work quite as well with that power structure, right? That would mean a lot less power for the CCP. Like they don't want that.
Right.
I heard a foreign diplomat, I won't say what country here, but a diplomat from the neighborhood, and he said something like, how would a democracy work in a country of 1 billion people? Like, how would that, could it even function? And I don't know if it can or not, but I mean, it's a question.
No, I pose the same one to just thinking about China. Like, so population of the world's grown and China's started to level off. So, somewhere between a fourth and a fifth of the world's people are there.
Right.
Just from a pure like logistics standpoint of like, of like delivering services, goods, money, and stuff. Just like don't even think about like the sort of running, but like a logistics standpoint. Like, could even the best logistics company in the world, I don't know, FedEx, Walmart, somewhere like that, could they make this work? Like a country that size, like actually work? Like
Right.
from that was that centralized, right? And that's, I mean, a lot of very much smarter sort of policy wonks and politicians or policy people than me looking at this of like the difficulty of running a country that central, that large, with that diversified now of a population. If everyone's poor, it's a lot easier. But
Right.
if everyone's got different needs and wants because they're all starting to get wealthy, how can they adjust to that group now? And it's not clear that they can. Right.
That's been sort of a fundamental American sort of point of hubris, for a long time, that we always expect that other countries truly want democracy and need democracy, and if we could just give it to them, then they're going to be A-okay.
Yeah. No, we've tried, I think, unfortunately, to influence more heavily the trajectory of some countries rather than, look, and I think that's something that we had, especially with regards to China. If you look back at our policy for a long time, we were doing, I mean, for taking as an example, we were purposely doing technology transfer to China from the government on all sorts of levels, all sorts of range of technology to build China up. For different reasons at different times. One, we wanted to have them oppose the Soviet Union, but then later because we want them to be bigger stakeholder and all sorts of other reasons. But it's not exactly clear that like they want stuff in the same way. They think about it in the same way that we do. They're in a very different place in the world. They have a different historical context. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the big shifts that happened in the last administration, and this administration has continued it, which is, all right, we're not in the, we're going to plan your future for your business anymore. We're going to lay out some standards. We're going to say this is the minimum you got to get to, and if you don't, then we're going to have problems. And that's kind of where we are now, where I think we've laid some of these out, and they're not meeting them, so that we're having some fights.
Well, could you expand on that a little bit? Like, where do you think we are in regards to our relationship with China? And I hate to like ask you to make predictions, but like thoughts about where you see it going in the near future?
Yeah, so I mean, in the immediate term, if you just think about the massive economic relationship that we have with China, I think there's just going to be a huge number of new regulations, controls put on it, right? Or different ways of sort of monitoring or kind of regulating it. Everything from, the most recent, I don't know if some people are following this, this is in my business now, the
semiconductors.
Yeah, the export controls, right? We basically like told China, like, hey, we're not selling you chips and we're not giving you stuff to make the chips anymore at a certain level because we don't want you to put them into your military equipment and come attack us.
And all
with
the
it,
Americans who are working there like,
Yeah.
like come home or else.
So and it is a pretty massive decapitation of an entire industry there, and they are scrambling right now to figure out what to do. So and China will respond, and respond in a number of different ways, and one of which will just ramp up economic espionage, and all the spies will be going after all the businesses stuff in a much greater way. But this is really just the beginning. This is just one industry. I mean, you could take quantum computing, you could talk about hypersonics, any type of sort of cutting edge technology, and it's going to be hard to think about what is not going to be potentially regulated. Go back 30, 40 years, what was clear, what was civilian technology versus military, there was a much clearer distinction. Certainly there was some stuff that was dual use. Now, so many things could be used for the military or used for intelligence purposes, right? I mean, you think about, just even like geolocation data, right? This is some of the stuff that's coming out about TikTok, right? That TikTok was pulling geolocation data of Americans. And people may be like, well, who cares about that? They know I was at the Burger King. I mean, whatever. But if you take that and you aggregate it with other data you have in other places, it might be able to help you figure out lots of things that you're doing, right? These just individual pieces of this. But if you think about if that data now is thought of as essentially having a national security purpose, or at least needs to be protected from a national security perspective, there's almost nothing that wouldn't be in that realm.
Right.
So if you're thinking about the future, like what is our relationship with them going to look like? These areas that got sort of designated as like, well, we're going to cooperate in some areas, compete in others, and then essentially confront in others. I think this is the sort of either Jake Sullivan or Biden sort of, these kind of different areas. I think the areas we're going to cooperate are going to probably shrink to zero.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll throw in the environment to everything, but even John Kerry's ready to throw a hat in and say, well, this is going nowhere. The areas where we compete are going to expand massively, and then more and more of those are going to kind of slip over into the confront area.
Yeah.
I don't know what's coming. I mean, but I think we're in sort of for, not just with China, but with Russia and there's a number of other powers. It's easier and easier for smaller powers to kind of punch above their weight. The U.S.'s ability to kind of keep a lid on things that we have for the last 75 so years is diminishing. Our desire to do it is diminishing, and maybe that's even more important. The U.S. doesn't want to exert, blood and treasure out in the world to do these things anymore. So the ability for other countries to push back is going to expand. That chaos kind of continues to escalate, and that it's going to be a very different place.
How do we get, because for instance with China, like you mentioned TikTok and the data. Well, and we also know that China owned a bunch of the DNA testing places that pregnant women were using, which could potentially be used to create designer viruses, specifically targeting individuals or whatever. How do we, we talk about this in a way because we're United States and we think about ourselves and it's the U.S. versus China, but there are all these other countries out there that also do not benefit from China, sort of expanding that. Are they stakeholders? How do we get them to become stakeholders so that it is not a U.S.-China?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're working on it, and it's going to be slow going. I think you're probably going to have blocks kind of slowly coalescing on both sides, and then you're going to have a lot of people kind of in between. They're trying to straddle both parts of it. And I think the EU is sort of getting its head around it. Australia certainly is, and I mean the Five Eyes. There's been a number of things. I'm not as confident about India. I know they're part of the Quad that we've got with as part of a bulwark to push back on China. It's not exactly clear. Certainly, some of their activity vis-a-vis Russia, where they're buying a lot of Russian oil, a lot of Russian military equipment, as they've done for years. So I mean, I think we've got a lot of work to do, and this is where the big problem from my perspective, I mean, as an American, but also I think that other countries should think about is like, we've also got a little bit of an issue sort of internally. I don't want to not get political, but we have some hyper-partisanship going on. Like right now we have a big disagreement about what are things going to look like in the U.S. for certain issues, but just even long-term, what are we going to have? And so as we're in that sort of, spirited discussion that's so wonderful in our country, and as we work this stuff out, that's a lot of kind of navel-gazing, right? And so if the U.S. is focused internally, and we're not projecting power out, that makes the world a very different place, right? So in terms of countries getting in line and doing that, they may think, well, if the U.S. is not paying attention, but China's out here exerting power, I have to deal with what's at home, right? Or, if you're Cambodia, the U.S. is far away, right?
Right.
And so I think they're still kind of waiting to see how much and what is the U.S.'s staying power. And this is why, maybe the Russians and the Chinese are ramping up all their malign influence in order to
Right.
just kind of churn things here in the U.S. get even worse.
It benefits them for us to be hyper-partisan, for the left and the right to be going at each other so much.
Absolutely. I mean, and they've done this before, right? The Soviets did this in the 1950s, the 1960s. And they've had a long-standing kind of operations against the United States to do it, and it essentially sucks all the oxygen out of the room because we're arguing with each other. And so, and to be fair, like there are some real serious issues that we do need to resolve. It's not being helped by the fact that we've got crazy, mis and disinformation floating around, that it's being ramped up by outside parties. But I think that, the U.S. looking internally, other places haven't quite figured things out. Like, I think it's going to be, it's hard right now for Russia and China, but I think it's probably going to start to get easier for them in the long run.
Do you foresee at any point the U.S. sort of, just like FISA, kind of goes outside of our protections for every citizen? Do you foresee any time in the future where our information policy also says, okay, if you're in America, you have privacy laws. If it's an IP that's coming from outside, or a hosted IP or a VPN, it doesn't have those same rights?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think we're in a really, cyber has totally obliterated. I mean, as we talked to the walls between foreign and domestic at this point. And there's two different models out there, right? The idea of cyber sovereignty, like what China and Russia call, and it's basically like you localize your data, you have control of it, you get to you have firewalls around it, so you only see things that you want your citizens to see. And the U.S. that's created this very kind of open system where everything can kind of flow. And I think from a philosophical standpoint, we like the idea of openness, but we have to acknowledge there are some real problems with it in some way. And this is just going back to my time overseas. And this is a very legitimate complaint that both the Russians and the Chinese had against the United States, was access to information. So think about this: if you've got two Russian citizens using Facebook to communicate, using the Facebook Messenger, and they're communicating about wanting to blow up a bus in Russia, how do they get that information? They don't have, there's no Facebook representative there that they're going to go and sort of process to. It's an American company.
Yeah.
So there is a process in place, and again, it's not to pick on Facebook, but and they've tried to deal with this, but at the end, they're at the whim or the desire of that private company. They cannot enforce that. Where the U.S. can go and tell Facebook, you have to give us that information today, right? This type of thing. That's a real issue, right? So, but if data can free flow and go everywhere, and people can have access to this stuff, that creates problems for governments to get access to information they need to protect their citizens. Flip side of that, of course, is they're also looking for all the dissidents who are talking about things. And so if you're Facebook, how do you figure out, like, is this a real legit sort of like they want to blow up a bus?
Right.
Or are these two guys who are being oppressed by the Russian government, and so they want, they want information on them. But you're putting a private company in the seat of like a judge, like an arbitrator of making these decisions, and that's incredibly difficult. So I just bring that up to your question of, like, I think we've got a really hard road to hoe here, because I don't know what the right answer is.
Right.
But our current setup that we're pushing from the U.S. is not without problems, not without real legitimate issues, and certainly their side of it is not something we want either. So what does that mean? I think we've got a lot of things to work through over time. But if we can't even get people to agree and sit down and talk at these meetings, and we're using them for like geopolitical head smashing, that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
Your next stop was the White House. You had an interesting title, National Security Council Counterintelligence Director. What was your job there? What did that entail?
Yeah, so there's National Security Council. There's a bunch of directorates, and then under everyone is a director for something, right? So a director for Middle East, or sometimes you have a director for like Syria. When Syria was big, you had this. So I was director for counterintelligence. And so my job was really to help coordinate policy and changes and anything that were happening at the national level between all the different agencies with regards to counterintelligence. And the way, I talked about this a little bit, how the Bureau thinks about counterintelligence is a little bit different than some other agencies. So, in a very traditional, strict sense, counterintelligence is you are countering the activities of an intelligence agency, right? But there was a recent report from the SISI, the Senate Select Committee, was talking about some of the changes that have happened, and that it's almost come from at least the FBI and some of the ways that there's not agreement on this, to be clear, but the way we deal with it sometimes is any actions by the government kind of becomes almost, that's going to be countered by the U.S., sometimes gets thrown under the umbrella of counterintelligence. And so I mention that because I dealt with intelligence issues, I dealt with malign influence, I dealt with all sorts of other just influence issues that had nothing to do with intelligence services. But it was government agencies from other places, private sector, some things. All these things that got kind of thrown under the umbrella, the rubric of counterintelligence. But it was essentially almost like any outside group that was trying to do harm to the U.S., I'd get pulled into meetings and they'd be like, all right, what's the Bureau think about this? Or what's the counterintelligence perspective? Or how do we protect ourselves from this? And so anyway, I did a lot of China work at that time as we were trying to move the U.S. from really, when we talked about these levels from a cooperative stance where we were really trying to help China kind of continue to build up. And there were still, in 2017 when I got there, still a number of agencies that saw their job as cooperating with China, as providing information, helping them build things, helping them, and to be fair to them, this had been
they don't see it as anything nefarious.
No,
yeah.
and we were told to do this, right? I mean, this is what the agencies are supposed to do. 10 years before, and things just changed so quickly with China. I think they couldn't even imagine that we actually had to worry about China, right? This place is poor, developing, but it's not a competitor by any means. And then all of a sudden, certainly after the financial crisis in 2008, power dynamics started to change pretty dramatically. So it was a lot of helping them understand, you can't be cooperating with them anymore. You can't be giving them misinformation. You can't be dealing with them, having our scientists go over there and teach them to do these types of things. And so, but then it also got to, as I talked about other organizations, it's trying to work with academic institutions, universities, and help them understand, look, if you're receiving government money, you might have to think twice about who has access to your labs.
Right.
You have this cutting edge, equipment, and you're doing this cutting edge experimentation, at least in part because of U.S. government support. That doesn't mean that anyone can run into your lab then and use that same equipment to do things that we don't want them to do.
Right.
But ran into a lot of cultural problems there. Right. That's the university system doesn't want controls on on information and knowledge.
And it's tough in today's climate. I imagine we've talked about this before, that anti-Chinese government action, anti-CCP action, will get branded as racist in a heartbeat, and then it'll inhibit your ability to stop them.
Yeah. So this is something that Chinese intelligence pushes. Absolutely. So one thing that they know that sort of is a third rail, and a lot of times in American politics, is if you're talking about sort of racial discrimination, and that can make everything grind to a halt. So they've seen that as something to grab onto and to focus on. At the same time, I think it's important to note that there are people who have focused on that. People who are like, well, if you have this background,
right.
People have been attacked and say, well, they're Chinese. Maybe 3 generations ago, their ancestors came from China, but they're Americans, right? Or they came and they're naturalized and they're Americans now. So I mean, there's a piece of this, and so one way that I always talked about is to rather than think of the people with these connections, based on ethnicity, but think about it in terms of vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Your ethnicity or your national origin, it really doesn't matter what what they are. It matters if you have financial connections or family connections. Mm-hmm. So I have no Chinese background whatsoever. If my sister worked for a multinational in Shanghai, I would be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Because of her being there, the security services, intelligence services could lean on her in a way, right? And so it's important to think about this stuff as a vulnerability, right? That connection can be a wonderful thing for, in terms of cultural aspect and even helping in all sorts of ways, but it also can make people more vulnerable. It doesn't necessarily make them a threat. And so I think part of the issue is that sometimes people jump to, well, if you're associated with that, you're a threat,
right,
rather than saying, no, you're vulnerable and you could be abused. Because sometimes it's unwitting, sometimes it's witting. But so that's an important, I think, distinction to make. But in some ways, the CCP has got us chasing our tail because they'll focus on saying, well, it's purely a racist sort of like attack on us, because you're attacking us. And so
Hawaii likes to play that game.
Yeah,
absolutely. And so the U.S. government's made a real strong attempt to focus on one saying PRC, People's Republic of China, right, and talking about that and using that as rather than saying something as Chinese, because that can obviously not just be the country, it could be the ethnicity, right? And then is also focused on talking about the party as the problem rather than the people, and I think that's a really good, important distinction, right? Because they're the vanguard, they're in charge. Most of the people don't even know what's going on, much less have any ability to make any decision. So whether they've been propagandized and are supporting them, that's important to note. But like at the end of the day, it's the party that we really have a problem with, and not the people.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like being up there at the White House at a high level and kind of, I know there's probably a lot of things you can't talk about, but I mean, you must have been, at least aware of some pretty like gnarly counterintelligence investigations and some things that, I mean, probably kept you up at night.
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, it's a crazy experience because as you imagine, I mean, there's sort of, the top secret, then there's SCI compartments, and then you have all these crazy programs where it's like 25 or 30 people in the country are read into them, or whatever. And so the benefit of that job is I got read into pretty much all of them. And so you see, the wonderful thing about it that actually helped me sleep at night is you do see all the stuff that the U.S. government is doing, and like some of the things that we have going on, and you're like, wow, that's really cool. Like this stuff is pretty amazing. We've been working at this for a long time, and we're doing a really, really good job. And then sometimes we're doing such a good job, we get access to information that is so concerning that it does keep you up at night.
Yeah.
It kind of goes back and forth.
Yeah.
But there were some things just, I mean, without going into detail, but like, I mean, in some ways this informs my ideas of what is kind of coming. And I think Americans tend to want to believe the best and be optimistic. And I think that can sometimes make us a little bit naive about what might be happening. And, there's a lot of much smarter commentators than me out there talking about, this last period since World War II of relative quiet, certainly since 1991, with, global war on terrorism is a glaring exception. But it's been relatively quiet, that it's probably an anomaly. And that we're probably going back to a much more competitive and conflict-ridden world. And so that was a lot of seeing sort of what appear to be indicators of that are kind of coming in from all different parts of the world, from different parts. The U.S. government has, obviously bases and stations and everything all around the world, and information kind of coming in about what is happening. And it's the one thing that just struck me was just the turmoil and chaos, right? Freedom House, does a survey each year, and I think last year, it was for the 16th year in a row, freedom has declined around the world. So for 16 years straight. And their prediction is that it's going to continue to go in that direction. And so just some of the things you're seeing there is that like we're getting up to a time where it's going to be very different than what we faced before.
Do you see a increase in foreign intelligence capability, or say foreign intelligence targeting us? But I'm interested in the volume, but also the capabilities. Are they sort of like that, vertical versus horizontal proliferation?
Yeah.
Like, are they increasing their capability, coming up, not probably able to match us, but getting closer?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I recall, the most recent reports have come out. So it doesn't mean they're exactly quite, but they're in our category.
Right.
And that covers a lot. I mean, MSS has 100,000 people in their organization. So there's some who are really good, and there are some who are like not.
Right.
So and that's where I think it's kind of confusing, because you'll see these operations. You're like
some kid going onto a Navy base taking pictures. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, stuff like that, or even the most recent one that came out. DOJ was charging those guys from Huawei, and like the kind of source control operations. You could see the dialogue. I mean, at least from my standpoint, it was pretty. He's revealing a lot of things he shouldn't have revealed. He's basically talking about what his boss wanted or didn't want, and all sorts of information you wouldn't want to tell a source if you want to kind of keep them strictly controlled and focused on things and stuff. So I don't know who it was exactly who was running it, but it didn't seem that's great. But back to your point, yes, I think that the number of agencies out there that are doing it, not just in Russia, China, but other places in the world, it's cheaper and cheaper to do this now. You've got a lot of private sector people getting into it. There's been some great articles recently about, Indian hackers for hire, and you can do that. There's a number of countries in the Middle East that tend to outsource a lot of their intelligence gathering. They pull in private organizations to do it, because they're their intelligence services are more inwardly focused. And in some ways, the sort of the collapse of distance and ability to reach out and touch anyone has made your ability to run operations against anyone just increased by a millionfold. Think about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is like the ultimate like recruitment tool in many ways, right? I mean, you can set up the search parameters on that to find people in a company with certain backgrounds, went to a certain school. You can figure out everything about them, all the things you would need to create a targeting package to go up and bump them and start a relationship with them. It's an amazing tool for being able to do all that. And so that type of stuff is really concerning in my mind, because it makes it so much easier to run, not just cyber operations, but a human operation where people can come in and start to run this. And it often doesn't take much to get people to want to persuade them to collect information.
There's one more question I wanted to get before we talk about sort of your private sector experience. A question I wanted to ask you about potentials for abuse, things that are like, the public has some concerns about. My friend Ken Klippenstein published an article this week about the Department of Homeland Security, and they had for a short time Council on Disinformation that was disbanded, and he writes in the article about it's a public-private partnership where the government will go to a Facebook and say, hey, we have some concerns about this maybe being disinformation. Can you, throttle that down, or can you take that off your website? And now the government, it's not the government ordering the company what to do, but nonetheless, there are concerns about censorship, who gets to define what disinformation is. And I was just wondering, since you worked at like kind of all levels of this topic, what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge mess in my mind. I don't know what to do. I mean, you got Elon Musk just bought Twitter, and whether you think that's the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, you basically have private companies are now in the business of arbitrating speech, right? Deciding what is acceptable, what isn't. Again, so this is ripe for the Supreme Court to step in to say you can't do this or can do this, or you're now sort of a, you're going to be considered a
utility.
I mean, essentially, everyone uses you, and so you're going to be considered. Essentially, you're going to have to protect these types of rights as well. Because right now, I mean, it's like First Amendment protects you against government action, right? And not necessarily against private action. So I think you've got the situation where the government is sort of in a really, U.S. government specifically is in a tough spot. And we talked about this when I was up there. There's another place in the State Department called the Global Engagement Center.
The GEC.
Yeah.
Run by a Navy SEAL and then a fighter pilot, and then, I don't know, they're not quite as bad today, are they?
No. I actually, they originally started doing kind of work on trying to put out, non-extremist information about Islam, right? Which is, an important piece. Just to go back to earlier story about the Tsarnaev brothers, his mom talked about, when Tamerlane was, they were Muslim but not religious, and when he decided he wanted to find out about it, what did he do? He went on the internet. And if you, back then, if you Googled Islam, you did not find the peaceful part of the religion that made up the majority of the people. You found the extreme stuff, and so that's what he encountered right away. And so the GEC was, created to try to make sure that you're getting a much richer kind of picture of how things go, and so I think similarly, they've been expanding kind of focus on, so some of the disinformation is put out by Russia, China, and other places. But they're a tiny organization, and there's a big question of should the U.S. government even be involved in this, right? No, what American believes information that comes from the U.S. government, right? There's an automatic sort of right, that's total nonsense, right? That's a politician saying that.
Well, it depends on if it's your president or not, right? Like if you're for Trump, then you believe what comes out. If you're for Biden, you believe what comes out. Obama, Bush, Clinton, right? We identify with that. But what government has ever been completely honest with its people?
Right. No, you see those stats, right? The common, what government institutions are always the lowest sort of level of trust and stuff, which, but no, I think it's a really tough spot. How does the U.S. encourage this environment? It basically, the information environment in the cyber world is nascent, and it has not fully developed. But like all industries that are new, the trash moves in first, right? So
Right.
this is like, what were the first, I'm going to date myself here, but, back when videotapes became the thing, like what drove VHS tapes? Porn, right? I mean,
Porn-
what drove
porn-
the internet to begin with?
Right.
Porn, right?
Porn
So,
made the VHS industry.
Right.
I mean, it did. Yeah.
so all these, I mean, you think about
We
this
got
sort
all
of-
these cameras and mics in here. We're in the wrong business.
Yeah,
Yeah, right.
It's getting uncomfortable now. So anyway, but I mean,
Here, have a drink. Wait.
this is for the second half of the show here. All right, we're going to delete that part right here. So, but no, I mean, I think there's a piece of this where it's like this is we're at the very early stages of this information environment, and it's the garbage that's in here right now, and we can't like kind of make sense of it. And so over time, it's going to, get better. And I think that the private sector should be the main piece of it, but there could be so much damage that could happen before that comes about.
Yeah.
But you've got, I mean, this is like, again, get back to like, so Elon Musk now is going to make more decisions about what speech is okay on Twitter, and that's a huge forum for information now. A guy who has significant business interests in China. I mean,
Right.
is this a guy who was spouting essentially Chinese views on Twitter?
Taiwan.
And also there's at least Ian Bremmer says he talked to Putin or received talking points from Putin. He denies it. Who knows? But he put out talking points that the Ukrainians were not particularly happy with. So again, not to pick on Elon Musk, but the idea being, should you have any private citizen making these types of judgments, right, about what is in the public sphere?
Well, but I mean, and I agree with you. And prior to that, whether it was an individual or a board,
Yeah.
they were banning people
Yeah.
for questioning whatever it might be. Right? They banned the New York Post for the Hunter Biden story.
Right.
For the laptop. So it's not just one individual; it's private
Absolutely.
citizens, right?
Yeah.
And private citizens have agendas, regardless of what those agendas are, and these organizations, they, like you said, they have become in a way utilities.
Yeah.
That people can in a way get depersoned, like lose their livelihood or their career if they are not on these,
Yeah.
or they get banned. And yeah, it's a question of how do you ensure that, whether it's an Elon Musk or a Jack Dorsey in the
Yeah.
board or who Zuckerberg or whomever else, that how do they combat misinformation, but also not just because the FBI says, hey, Facebook, the stuff on
Yeah.
Biden's laptop is Russian disinformation, that they don't bury it.
No, and that's a fair. And I don't mean to imply that it was better previously with the board necessarily, right? Maybe it was better in some ways and worse in others, or it was worse. I mean, I don't even know how to judge it. But the point, as you made, is you've got private citizens doing their best. Facebook set up a similar kind of group of experts to kind of arbitrate this stuff, right? Which I imagine is a bit of sort of First Amendment theater that they've kind of put in there to allow these things to go forward. But I think we've got a big fight on our hands coming up with this.
It's tough because when we, like right now, when we look at the COVID vaccines or whatever, and we look at the data coming out, one, you don't want to discourage people, but you want to have the scientific debate. What if this were the smallpox vaccine?
Yep.
And there were people saying, no, don't do it. Where it was necessary, or what if it was electroshock therapy or lobotomies? It's difficult to determine when something is actual debate, when it is targeted misinformation.
Yeah. No, I don't have it. I don't know if there's a good solution for it. I'm not sure if the days of Walter Cronkite delivering the news for everybody were necessarily better in every ways, right?
Right.
I mean, certainly some things were better than others, but why did he have such a kind of an ability to make those decisions?
Right. What was the news? People decided was the news.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is one of those things that you think about could easily consume, American society, thinking about this and trying to figure it out. And it's rough. I will say without sounding too, rah-rah patriotic, as much as rough as it is, I think it's the right way to do it, right?
Right.
I don't want a take China as an example, having, a bunch of technocrats who have my best interests at heart, who are making decisions about, I need a firewall to protect me so I don't, have
Right.
ideas bothering me. I don't want that. The flip side of that, though, I hope most Americans come to understand is that means that we have these debates that can get kind of ugly, and
Right.
we should try to make them as less ugly as possible, less personalized, right?
Right.
But this is our methodology for trying to find some sort of middle ground compromise, and it takes time. But if the less we try to kill each other during that, the better, right?
Do you, having been in China and understanding their system, and maybe social credit wasn't kind of a thing then, I don't know.
It started to be, yeah.
But do you see a potential for it in the United States? Do you see any traces of it in the United States? Or do you think that we can slip by that and avoid it completely?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're going to have to be really careful that we do not fall into or get kind of lured in by the siren song of surveillance technology. I think a lot of people see that as this sort of wonderful panacea that's going to solve all our problems, right? Just in the current job, we talk to a lot of businesses, and we talk to them about how to protect their employees and protect themselves from losing information. And their response a lot of times can be, well, we've got this wonderful tool that allows us to see everything that they're doing. I'm not sure the employees know that they have that tool, but I think we need to be very careful believing that technology is going to solve all this, right? Their ability to watch all this stuff. And so social credit, I think, is just a kind of even larger system, right, of where you're essentially surveilling their bankruptcy, their marital status, and their maybe their Tinder feed as well as their Twitter feed, right, to see what they're doing, and then coming up with some wonderful algorithmic kind of results that no one can kind of peer inside it to figure out how
Is
it's
it
actually
patriotic?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is
it the right? Yeah.
I mean,
Is it the right talking points?
Yeah, I think this is going to be really difficult, and I mean, this is maybe the challenge of AI. I mean, of how do which we don't necessarily have. We just have machine learning at this point, but at some point we may have something much closer to AI. And how do we use it without sort of destroying ourselves, right?
Right.
To go back to Elon, he's very worried about it, and then even to connect to Putin, who said the person who controls the country that controls AI will control the world.
Right. And we've seen some bad experience with AI where they did the Twitter AI, I think, and after getting sort of stampeded or brigaded, that it did nothing but curse and.
Oh, it was super racist.
Right. Yeah.
That was horrible.
Right. Right.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that we're still trying to learn how to figure that out, but I think there's this piece of assuming that technology is going to solve all of our issues, rather and that we just create the right formula. At the end of the day, it's what is that? How is that weighting going on? And then what is the information that's going in there? Someone is having to decide that, right?
Right.
And so you put good information. The whole idea of garbage in, you're going to get garbage out,
right?
So I think there's a little bit of we get, I think particularly Americans get kind of enamored with technology and to think that's going to solve our problems,
right?
Big time.
And I think there's parts that can make our lives better,
right?
But I have young kids, I mentioned, and so my wife and I are constantly reading about all the sort of problems that are caused by social media to kids. And you think about all the sort of negative effects of it, and I'm like, and so what are we getting out of this at the end of the day?
Right. But almost every dystopian story we have that's been popular from Fahrenheit 451 and 1984 onward to Brazil and Terminator and everything else, that has something to do with technology, right?
Yeah.
Could you talk to us then about sort of going into the private sector and what you're up to today?
Yeah. Thanks. So so I saw a need, and I mean, being at the NSC and at the Bureau, we're really focused on the playing field and how to protect that. But we realized that there's a lot of companies and individuals that just weren't getting the sort of kind of preparation that they needed. I've in the Bureau, you're kind of always kept at arm's length with regards to companies and what they've got going on, and so being out in the private sector now, it's a lot easier to kind of bring you into the fold. So basically, we have a boutique consulting that helps companies deal with nation-state threats, right? So these are human-driven kind of threats, and we have human-driven solutions. So we don't focus so much on the cyber piece of it in terms of the technical piece of it. I think there's a lot out there dealing with that, for better or for worse. We focus really on kind of how the people interact with technology, the facilities, and even interact with each other. If you look at statistically on, cyber intrusions, still upwards 90% plus are because of poor control of credentials, no multi-factor authentication, clicking on links, downloading things they shouldn't have. So ultimately, it's still the vast majority relates back to people. And so the best piece of software is not going to protect you from that. You have to focus on people. And so for us, it's about having creating that awareness of you are an important part to this, and whether or not you appreciate it or not, your company has been pulled into a massive geopolitical struggle, and the quicker you get your head around that and realize that there really are, intelligence officers in China, in Russia, in Iran, in all sorts of other countries in the world trying to steal your information, the better you'll be able to protect your company, your family, your livelihood, and that type of thing. So we try to help give advice and think about this, depending on what kind of company you are, if you make semiconductors or, if you're making, if you've got data or things, what are the types of assets that essentially intelligence officers and others are coming after, how they're going to come after you, and then how can you protect yourself in the private sector? It's a little bit difficult or different in some ways because you don't have the same tools of protection that you do in the government, right? You don't have the same tools to find this stuff out. So it's a lot more sort of risk analysis versus investigations and stuff. So it's been an adjustment, but it's fun. You can be a lot more creative, I think, than you can in the government, which is often kind of your blinders on. And we've gotten to touch a lot of different companies that didn't get to kind of get as close to before.
That's fantastic.
Where can people find these services? Where can they find you if they're interested in?
So we're on the internet. Trenchcoat Advisors is the company, we happy to always talk with if companies are interested and work with individuals sometimes if they're kind of concerned about themselves, in terms of their own security. So my partner is Bill Priestep. He was the head of Counterintelligence for 3 years. A few more people have joined us now and starting to work with more. But really, it's about, for us, it's more kind of strategic. How do you navigate this, right? Especially if you are one of those semiconductor companies that used to sell to China. What do you do at this point, right? What should you be prepared for? Which is ramped up economic espionage on your company, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you're doing because it kind of rang a bell for me because I remember somebody, I think it was at Special Operations Command, saying at SOFIC one year, we need a computer program that can identify disinformation. It's hold on a second, buddy. If that program ain't up here, it doesn't matter what the software is.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's a big piece of it, right? I mean, there's a lot of software out there that supposedly gives all these great solutions, but at the end of the day,
the people are vulnerable.
And you're right. I mean, for like you said, 80-90% of cybercrime, not even the intelligence aspect, but just the crime, which is a multi-billion-dollar. It costs businesses billions of dollars every year just in the United States. It's phishing. It's those human-oriented attacks.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from folks out there?
We do. We have some questions. We got some spicy questions. I don't know
some
if we have
spicy.
I don't know. I don't know. I was just saying that. Let me see what we got going on here. Pop over to the studio. And all right. Danny, thank you very much. This is a great question. Was Holden's father a big J.D. Salinger fan?
Oh, no. I wish my parents were that literate even. Holden's actually my paternal grandmother's maiden name, and so it's a family name. So there's a bunch of, my dad's from Mountain View, Missouri, where there's interestingly no mountain and no view, but and there's a bunch of Holdens and triplets around there for some reason when they immigrate over there. So
no Holden Caulfield.
Nope.
Caulfield. Jerry, thank you very much. What is your opinion of the ports of New York and New Jersey? Do you think they are deliberately open to immigrants from China?
I have not heard that. I can't imagine they'd be deliberately open to them. But there's human sort of trafficking is a massive issue just around the country, around the world. And China has some huge issues with that. So it's funny, actually, that is one issue that we were able to work with them on, was human trafficking to some degree when we were in China at times. And then there was, anyway, it became frustrating, but that was one that they had some time for us on, and it was a serious issue. There are some really powerful criminal operations. I mean, obviously, I haven't heard of the triads, but there's a number out throughout China that kind of bring people in. So I don't know if it's purposeful, but I mean, that sometimes it's just the corruption is so endemic and rife, and it's pretty easy for a criminal organization to exploit it.
Do you feel as though politicians are becoming more security aware when it comes to immigration issue? Not just immigration, but like who they allow on their staff, who they're partnering with, who they're taking donations from, things like that.
At the federal level, for sure. At the state level and the local level, I don't think so. I think that there's been a couple articles that have come out. Axios did one probably about a year ago, and there was another one recently. They're still at a point where it's like, ex-Chinese city calls up and says, "Hey, we want to set up a friendship with your town in Idaho," and they put
out a warning like 3 months ago, warning like small businesses, like you need to be aware of.
And I think they're starting to get their heads around it, but there's a huge kind of gulf of understanding at this point. So I don't think people take it as seriously. And again, I think kind of to your point earlier, there's a little bit of people are like, well, I can't do this because then I'll be considered discriminating or racist. And again, from my perspective, this is not approached as if that person is a threat. It's like understanding that people have vulnerabilities based on where they may have family.
Right.
Their particular ethnic national background is irrelevant. Actually, right? Just approach it that way. And so if this person happens to be of whatever ethnicity but has no connection to China whatsoever, and they don't have any family over there, then they're probably just as safe as anyone else is. At that point,
Right. Ohms, thank you very much for the donation. This is more a comment, I guess. I know the Bush administration offered ports to UAE and Saudi Arabia. Not sure about Saudi Arabia, but yeah, that's a thing. Thank you, Ohms. Danny, thanks again. Was Agent Triplett involved in the investigation raid on Mar-a-Lago? Is he able to speculate on why Donald Trump hasn't been indicted yet?
So no, I left the bureau about 2 years ago. So I was, and have not been on the investigative side for a couple of years now. So all I could say on any of those cases that I can't imagine the machinations and the scrutiny that goes into. Everyone is fully aware that you're damned if you do and damned if you don't at this point. There is no safe answer on any side. So it's probably pretty rough for everybody.
RS, thank you very much for the donation. Thoughts on former agent Robert Hansen, Eric O'Neill, and the movie Breach?
Yeah, I liked it. I mean, I think. Look, I mean, Hansen obviously was just devastating to the United States and to the bureau specifically. But I think there's something, and I can't go into any detail, but I understand now. The feeling that people have, and they talk about it a little bit in the movie, which I thought was done pretty well, about someone that you work with that you assumed was you're on the same team, right? I mean, you guys have been in government. You're doing jobs that are very difficult. You're often doing it for pay that is a quarter or less of what you could make in the private sector, and you're doing it with people many times because you feel like you're part of a mission, part of a team. And if you suddenly realize that one of your team has been working against you the entire time and undermining all the things that you believed in, it's pretty devastating. And I think that it's been a while since I've seen the movie. I think it captures it well. But obviously there's some huge intelligence kind of issues with impact of what Hansen did. But I think that maybe underappreciated is the impact they had to the organization. Just the feelings of just mistrust and just that you've got someone in your midst that worked against us.
Right. That was like kind of the one thing that I noticed James Olsen get a little choked up talking about was Aldrich Ames.
Yeah,
he's like, I knew Ames had a problem with alcoholism, and
they were friends.
I didn't
really?
say. He's like, I didn't say anything because I liked him as a person, and I think he said it was like one big oversight, the one lapse that he felt in his career.
Yeah. Well, I can understand. I mean, it's one of these things where, again, you think in the movies it's portrayed as like, it's clear, it's someone, they're shifty and, and all these things. And like, it's not. It's often, people who are, like all humans, are flawed. And they make a series of bad decisions to get themselves in a place. I mean, I don't think Alder James started off as knew he was going to be a traitor for his entire life. And joined the CIA with
He
that
didn't grow
purpose.
up. He was an 8-year-old laying in bed saying, "I want to be an FBI
Right.
traitor." Yeah,
Exactly. And same with Hansen. And so,
not Ames. Yeah, sorry.
but no, but and so you think about the trajectory that person goes on to go from a place of where at some point I imagine they believed in what they did and believed that they were a part of it, and then to suddenly go to a place where they could betray everyone. That it's a very human journey, and I think it's upsetting, but at the same time, like there's a piece of it I think that we don't really fully understand and have explored, like
what that person does psychologically to convince themselves this is okay.
Yeah, I mean, some serious cognitive dissonance there. They're saying that this is I'm doing. I mean, Hansen believed he was helping the bureau, right?
Hansen was a curious case. He's not a normal sort of traitor. He his motivations are more opaque.
Yeah, absolutely, and but and sort of from an intel perspective, kudos to the Russians for being flexible to deal with someone like that, right? I mean, but that's part of the game in many ways of like you have people come to you for all sorts of different reasons of why they want to provide information, and you have to figure out if it is a good reason, if it's a reason that you can believe in the information, can you validate it, all these sort of things, and it's extremely complicated, but it's rare that it happens so cleanly that you can just say, oh, well, great, this is good. And
right.
And if it is, it's probably such a low level, it's not impactful. But when it gets up to that level, it's horribly complicated.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Wiz, thank you very much. How do we de-incentivize? De-incentivize economic espionage carried out by our own geopolitical allies. Example: France, Japan,
Israel.
Disincentivize.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we can disincentivize them. I think we have to I think we're going to have to. We just got to put up protections for it. I mean, this is the difficult thing I think with allies. Be it Israel or South Korea or France or whatever, that we align in many ways, but in their mind, you got to get inside their head, which is, all right, today the U.S. cares about my issues, but will they tomorrow?
Right.
And so what do I need to do? I need to get everything I can out of this relationship, right? Obviously, we don't like that from our perspective, but you can understand why they see it that way, right? They don't have the hundreds of years of close relationship like the UK does, and that they can depend on that's going to be there. But I mean, one way to do it is to sort of have a much more open. Well, a couple of different ways. You have a much more open sort of where we share certain high technology with them, which I think we're starting to do with some places like in Japan. And then the other is they develop their own sort of internal, intellectual property regime that is worthwhile. And so that even if a company steals something, you go to Japan, you can sue them. You go to France, you can sue them, right? And so that could happen over time, and that's something that the U.S. could require them to, sort of enact in order to have access to certain things.
Right.
And so maybe that's something that my successors at the NSC can work on right now. So,
Jerry, thank you very much. Who is your favorite Russian writer and why? I could type in Russian, but those guys would butcher that. Yeah. You
True.
can answer in Russian. You can answer in Russian if you want. Jerry, you're showing your colors, man. No.
My favorite Russian writer. I mean, Dostoevsky, I would guess. And I was a Russian literature major at Texas, so I read a bunch a long time ago, and I do really like it. It's very dark, but that seems kind of cliche to pick Dostoevsky. I'll have to think about it a little more. There's some more recent ones that are more interesting, but.
Oh wait, let me check the Patreon real quick. Isaac, you're asking some really political questions here. So we talked about this a little bit, but what was it like being in China, Russia? And how do you compare them? How are they different? And who is harder?
Yeah, I think China was harder in a lot of ways. I felt like there was a lot more distance between how we talked about things and how we saw things than Russia. It doesn't mean that it was necessarily we're going to come to an agreement with Russia. You know, sometimes the worst fights can be between siblings, right? In some ways, like people that you agree on a lot of different things. But in some ways, just the perspective in China and the way that the system worked there, it was just so different. I can tell you, like, one of the things I spent a lot of time on is even trying to help them understand if they wanted to, because they had a lot of frustrations, and I saw part of my job is helping not only like the U.S. communicate to China, but help China communicate to the U.S. Because in my mind, confusion on either side is not a good thing, right? For countries that could eventually get into some sort of hot conflict. And so if I can help them, you know, sort of think about what is important, like how do you express what matters to you, like then helping them do that and you know, kind of plug into the U.S. system, and so they're actually talking to the people that can hear this and make decisions based on it. But it was difficult, and I guess I attribute that to, and not a cultural thing, but Russia at least had kind of gone back to a place where power is a bit more, as much as the security services had a lot of power, it had decentralized quite a bit, right? You had businesses that had a lot of power, business leaders, and so in many ways it felt a lot more like the U.S., where it was a lot more, there was, you know, there were connections, but at least when I was there in 2012 and 2014, it was more like decentralized different areas of power. That's not how it was in China. It was really still sort of as a pyramid. And that part of it, I hadn't really, I mean, I'd been in Russia in 93, but things had already fallen apart. I had never really experienced before, kind of being in a place that is, they're not quite totalitarian yet, but they were on their way. And like you could kind of feel it in a way that was very different. And so being in a totalitarian state, I kind of missed the tail end of the Cold War, and that's what it felt like, the sort of beginnings of it in China. Obviously, I'm sitting around talking to the security service, so my experience is different than other people.
Right.
But that was the major difference, I'd say.
When you were there in Russia and China, did you bother doing like surveillance detection, or did you just assume that you were tailed all the time?
Yeah, so I had a kind of, I mean, sort of a unique, and this is what I would tell people when they'd come to visit from the Bureau or from other places. I was like, so we're not running operations. So I was like, do not do surveillance detection. So basically, I'm telling this to the FBI people, you've been on the other side where you've had to watch somebody.
Right.
And when they make it difficult for you, it's kind of a pain in the ass.
Right.
Like when they're being jerks and they'll cross the street like 50 times and they're just messing, like then, you know, and so trying to think about it from professional courtesy. If I'm going to the zoo, there were times where I would wait because they were slow and they got caught in traffic, or they, you know, and so I hoped, you know, because look, they had to do a job and they had to make sure that I wasn't going and doing anything untoward or that I wasn't supposed to be doing there, and I wasn't, so it didn't bother me, and I thought that it'd just make it easier for them to do their job.
Yeah.
But every now and then they just kind of appear to kind of do a little show of force.
Yeah.
I can think of when I was on the way to the zoo, we were with kids and like turned around and then there's like 6 guys just sitting at the fence just staring at me the entire time, like probably about like
Smoking
2 feet
cigarettes.
away. Yeah, basically.
Where's Holden?
Well, I was like, God, I feel like there's someone watching me. I turn around, yeah, and there's like 6 guys just sitting there watching. And I was like, oh, there you are. and every now and then they do that, just, you know, kind of make sure you know that they're there,
Right.
sort of thing.
Now, did you ever do the same thing, like walk into a sandwich shop and then just turn around at the counter and wait for them to come in and give them a nod?
No, I didn't ever want to embarrass them, to like make them, you know, make them feel like they got made, because if that would kind of make it more difficult for them, because then, you know, they don't have the same sort of restrictions, and so there's all sorts of like, you know, they're going to come in and like, you know, like pee in my bed or something like that.
Right, toss your apartment.
Yeah, we had a dog. I didn't want
Right.
to kill the dog.
Right.
And, you know, it would have just been, I was like, you know, what am I going to gain other than just being like, you know, kind of a jerk to them.
Right.
The only thing I would do, and this is so childish, but now that I'm out of the government, I'll say this.
Surveillance games, ladies and
So
gentlemen.
this wasn't even surveillance. This is me. Just I would, you know, every now and then I would Google something that was, you know, sort of something about Russian men and inabilities to do certain things, because I'm assuming they're reading through all of my Google searches,
right.
And so it's all like my Google, Taylor Swift or whatever
Right.
else I'm googling at the time, right? And then it comes in, why do Russian men are they unable to perform? And
Right.
so all these very technical things about. So I just hope they would give them a little bit of a laugh,
Yeah.
that when they're reading through all of my Google searches, that they would kind of see that one thing. That was the only entertainment part I would do to them, but.
I do that for the FBI agent that monitors this
Yeah.
office. Holden, this has been awesome, man. I really appreciate you coming in and sharing some really unique insights that I don't think too many people have.
Oh, my pleasure.
And I hope the next time you come through New York City, we can have you over again. And I mean, there's a lot to discuss here, and obviously these issues are not going away at all. We're still going to be talking about this in 10, 20 years.
We have 2 more questions, and please thank you everybody much for your donations. We're not accepting any more after these 2. I'm going to, first off, Peter, thank you very much. I never realized that Casey Jones, after working with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, became even more of a badass counterintelligence agent. Another great show. Yeah, you forgot your hockey mask. Didn't Casey Jones wear a hockey mask?
He had hockey sticks
Yeah.
and baseball bats.
Yeah.
You call this and that over there a family?
And then right now, thank you very much. Why won't the FBI give over Seth Rich's laptop?
Seth Rich? Oh. I don't know.
There you have
I
it.
don't know. I wasn't involved in
There
that.
you have it.
I don't know the
Holden doesn't
specifics.
know.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your questions. And thanks, Holden. We really appreciate
We
it.
will see all of you guys on Friday with Mr. McCoy, Air Force 24th STS Special Ops dude. He'll be here in studio. We're excited to talk to him too. And so until then, we'll see you guys